Good morning, church. How y'all doing? All right, good to be with y'all this morning. Thank you for the invitation to be in this pulpit. I am grateful for my friend and colleague Dwayne's invitation. I am also deeply grateful for the support of all the folks who've made it possible for me to come in, not knowing anything about the way y'all do things, and make it look like I know what I'm doing. So thank you. So one kind of funny thing that you might want to know about me is that this queer Unitarian Universalist pastor lady who gets paid to do social justice work agitating against the status quo, I grew up going to very conservative Catholic schools. And yes, you can make all the jokes about how it makes total sense that I turned out the way that I did. Anyway, to say the least, I was not a ray of sunshine in my religion classes at school. And in fact, I am still praying for forgiveness for how my younger self rebelled against my poor teachers, who really, let's be honest, were just trying to do their jobs. They're trying to teach me some good old Christian morality and the commandments and the rules for living a good life. One day when I was being particularly recalcitrant, I was arguing with one of my teachers about how ridiculous it was to have so many rules. And she just sighed. And she looked at me and she said, Ashley, if you don't know the rules, how are you going to know when it's the right time to break them? Well, so that's what we're dealing with in today's gospel. A story about who knows the rules and who knows when to break them. So we're going to dive right in here with Jesus. What is all this hubbub between Jesus and the leader of this synagogue, okay? So to understand what's going on here, we have to look at the concept of Sabbath, of Shabbat, and how exactly to follow God's commandment to keep it holy. And you got to know that this has been a controversial subject in the Jewish faith and then in Christian communities since the very beginning. Now, the first time we hear about keeping the Sabbath holy, pop quiz, anybody know this one? Genesis? Not Genesis. We hear about it in Exodus, okay? In the Ten Commandments. But you are absolutely right that the echo, right, is back to Genesis because it's about creation, the first time we hear about it. So, you might remember this episode. Moses is on Mount Sinai. The Israelites are camped at the bottom. God decides to descend in like the biggest showgirl kind of way possible. Clouds and fire and lightning and the whole thing. Everybody stand there or you're going to be struck down. God comes and says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God, and you shall not do any work. You, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Now, aside from God doing a little Bob Dole here and talking about God's self in the third person, this passage is remarkable because of its explanation for why we have Sabbath. To remember the goodness of creation and to rest in that goodness. In other words, if the Lord needed a break after making the universe, we could probably do with a little bit of rest ourselves every once in a while. Now, another thing to know about me is that I am a consultant who has worked with dozens of congregations. I am also the parent of a 4.5-year-old. And both of these experiences have taught me that humans create rules in response to stuff going wrong, not in anticipation of things going right. So, for example, I worked with a congregation in which they had a policy that no chickens were allowed in worship. Why? Because they had a member who kept bringing her pet rooster to church with her. People don't invent rules like no chicken in worship if there's not a reason, right? And at my house, you might think I'm very strict, but there is a rule that nobody is allowed to dip their hair in syrup or yogurt or spaghetti sauce and then use that hair to paint on the walls. I'm going to let you guess about the backstory for that one. Now, I'm naming all of this because Jewish law has a huge amount of detail about what does and doesn't count as work on the Sabbath. There are 39 categories, in fact, of prohibited activity that range from writing to baking to laundering to exchanging money to extinguishing fires to slaughtering animals. Now, my experience tells me that the rabbis didn't all just get together one day and sit down and hash it out, those 39 categories all at once. I bet these prohibitions were arrived upon by one at a time in response to very specific situations. And while I am also sure that the rabbis were doing their utmost, most faithful work to honor the spirit of God's commandment to keep holy the Sabbath day, they were wisely advising their people to engage in this communal practice of weekly days of reflection and rest. To be honest, I'm not really sure whether God cares that much if I use a tea bag or if I comb my wig on the Sabbath day. In other words, sometimes we humans go overboard in trying to pin down every single detail of how we should and shouldn't act because it's easier to have a specific rule than to deal with the ambiguity of multiple truths and possibilities. So, this brings us back to Luke's story of Jesus healing on the Sabbath. So, imagine you are the leader of this synagogue, and you are charged with being the chief interpreter of Jewish law, helping your people be the best people that they can be. Now, it's a typical Shabbat in the synagogue, and all of your regular congregants are here to pray and worship and observe the Sabbath together. And then, out of nowhere, through the back door, comes Jesus. He is not the associate rabbi. He is not the invited guest preacher. He just shows up, and he starts desecrating the holy Sabbath day. Healing, as you might have guessed, is under one of the prohibited categories of work according to Jewish law, except in the case of someone's life being in danger. But imagine, this woman that Jesus lays his hands on is one of your congregants. She's someone you have seen every week for years. And when you look at her this morning, you see her back hunched as it has been since you've known her. It's a sad situation because she is in pain, but it is no more serious than it was yesterday or last week or a decade ago. So here's the thing. Rules and policies are mutually agreed upon boundaries. They make us feel safe. They give us guidance about how to act. They keep us from hurting ourselves and one another. We might not always like them, but without them, the world would just be too wild and too dangerous and unpredictable. So it's no wonder that when Jesus sweeps in and starts causing this chaos by healing this afflicted woman, all the people start clamoring for more. They give me the heal me and fix me, Jesus, And all this poor leader of the synagogue can do is to spit and splutter and say, there are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, not on the Sabbath day. In other words, God rested, and so must we. We've got to follow the rules or there's going to be anarchy, right? Now, where have we heard that one before? In his letter from a Birmingham jail, Dr. King lambasted the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes that he can set the timetable for another person's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. We've got to follow the rules or else there's going to be anarchy, they said. A few years ago, as the movement for Black Lives was surging across the country, activists and communities, including our own beloveds here in the Twin Cities, were rising up to shut down freeways, occupy city halls, disrupt business as usual to protest the police killings of Black people. And we heard the cry over and over again from so-called progressive people of all races. We agree with your cause, but we can't support your tactics. You have to work inside the system to change the system. We've got to follow the rules or there's going to be anarchy, they said. And right now, right this moment, on the Sunday morning talk shows are the pundits who are pontificating about this manufactured humanitarian crisis at our southern border. They're talking about the creation of concentration camps to cage thousands of black and brown bodies. They're talking about the separation of babies from their parents, the deaths of dozens of people at the hands of our government, locked up and neglected and abused and defiled simply for seeking refuge from the horrendous conditions of war and poverty and violence in their homelands. And as these pundits sit talking about the situation, in their silk blouses and their Italian suits, at least some of them are saying those people knew what the consequences would be. Detention should be a deterrent. We have to protect our borders and keep people from going around the legal immigration process at any cost. We've got to follow the rules or else there's going to be anarchy, they say. It's an old trope. After he heals the woman, the leader of the synagogue quotes Exodus to Jesus, presumably to remind him of the rules. But Jesus, a very biblically literal man, literate, not literal, literate, what's this important? Jesus says to him, don't you give your donkey and your ox water to drink on the Sabbath? Now remember, they're living in the Middle East. We're talking 110-degree temperatures. You don't feed and water your animals, what happens? They die. So Jesus says, that's not prohibited by the law. So why shouldn't we do the same for our human siblings? What's going on here is that Jesus has a different interpretation of the Sabbath commandment, which is rooted in a different scripture. It's an interpretation that many Jewish leaders have had over the centuries, in fact, and it is from the book of Deuteronomy, the last of the sacred 5 books of the Jewish Torah. And the writers reiterate the Sabbath commandment there. So similar to the book of Exodus, it starts like this. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall do no work, neither you nor your son nor daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns, so that your male and female servants may rest as you do. We've heard that before, pretty similar to Exodus. But then, instead of talking about God's creation of the universe and the day of rest on the 7th day, this version ends, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. In this Deuteronomy version, the idea isn't simply that we rest on the 7th day because God did. It's that we rest on the 7th day because that is the day in which we get to not just imagine, but to try to live in total liberation, into the flourishing and the wholeness of all creation, into that closeness of living beings with God. And anything that stands in the way of that kind of closeness, that kind of liberation, is an affront to the holy, and it must be destroyed. God's will is toward life and toward wholeness, and anything that blocks that must be changed. So Jesus heals this woman not because she's disabled, and I want to be clear about this. This is not an ableist reading about people with different kinds of bodies, different kinds of ways of walking through the world. Jesus heals her because her affliction is causing her pain, and it is keeping her from being in full community with everybody else around her. She's walking in such a way that she can't make eye contact. People are looking at her as if she is outside and other. So this kind of suffering is avoidable, and this kind of exclusion is fixable. And so Jesus said, this is outside of God's will and it must be corrected regardless of the rules. This is saving a life, Jesus argues. And nothing is more important than that. I've been thinking a lot about what my life would be like if I really totally lived into that idea. What would I be willing to risk? Which rules would I break? Who would I be willing to piss off, excuse my French, in service of a higher cause? What kind of sacrifices would I be willing to make? Most recently, I've been considering these questions as I've watched our Jewish siblings respond to this current political moment with strength and courage and fierceness, what they would call chutzpah, as the Yiddish goes. I don't know if you followed this in the news, but since the end of June, over 40 groups of Jewish activists around the country have engaged in direct actions against Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and in solidarity with migrant families who are being harassed and separated and abused and deported by the US government. The national movement uses the slogan, "Never again is now." And they say, as Jews, we were taught never to let anything like the Holocaust happen again. We refuse to wait and see. We know from our own history what happens next. Many of our ancestors narrowly escaped from conditions like what we are seeing today in concentration camps at the border and detention centers around the country. Never again is now. If you've ever wondered what you would have done if you had been alive in the 1940s, they say, this is the moment of truth. This is the time to put our bodies on the line, because when we say never again, we mean never again for everyone. Just a few weeks ago, on July 30th, our Jewish siblings right here in the Twin Cities organized a direct action at the Whipple Federal Building in Bloomington. They shut down the streets surrounding the facility for about 4 hours, beginning just when ICE employees were getting off shift and going home. I was there in solidarity that day with both my Jewish friends and our migrant kin, and my 4-year-old and I spent a few hours chanting and singing alongside these powerful leaders. At one point, an ICE employee in a huge SUV, frustrated that the marshals were blocking his path out of the parking lot, actually swerved across the grass and pushed through a line of protesters, almost knocking people to the ground and crushing them. I wish I could say that this is the first time that I've seen an angry person nearly kill a protester, because their schedule was disrupted by our calls for justice, but it's not. As we were heading home, my 4-year-old and I and another mom and her kid, we walked to the light rail platform, and there was a white woman in her 40s or so, and she said, "Are you the protesters?" And we said, "Yes." She said, "Are you finally going home?" I said, "Well, we are, but my friends are staying. They're not going anywhere for a while." She looks at me and says, "Do you know how many people you are inconveniencing by being here right now?" And I said, "Why don't you talk to those babies in cages about what inconvenience looks like?" The point, my friends, is that while it is absolutely true that most laws are here to keep us safe and well and free, sometimes laws are put in place to privilege one group over another, to treat some people as if they were more worthy than others, to break the spirit of the many in favor of the greed and the ego of the few. Jesus tells us clearly in today's gospel, we must break the law when the law goes against God's will for human flourishing and liberation. We must break the law when the law is keeping someone oppressed. We must break the law when the law gets between us and our full potential for life and freedom and well-being. Some of us, particularly people who live in bodies that look like mine, we've most of our lives felt safer because of the laws and the authorities who enforce them. And so Jesus' exhortation to stop worrying about making people mad and following the rules, not causing a scene, that feels scary. But for others among us, and those of us for whom the law and its enforcers have always been a sledgehammer rather than a safeguard, including so many of us in this room in the queer and trans community, those of us who are people of color, those of us who are disabled, we know that sometimes the most faithful, most righteous thing to do is to break the rules for the sake of the world. We are living in exceptional times, beloveds. And as the oceans rise and the Amazon burns and the powerful try to squash the humanity of black and brown and queer and trans and undocumented and poor and disabled people, there is always going to be a synagogue leader, a pastor, a police officer, a supervisor who chastises us for our audacity in breaking the rules, who whispers that if we just behave, we'll be safe and the system will protect us, who shakes their head and says, those people wouldn't have been beaten or deported or evicted or killed if they'd just obeyed the law. But Jesus reminds us that we gotta be braver than that. We have got to be braver than that. Whether we sponsor an asylum seeker or welcome them into their homes, whether we go to a candidates forum and force the participants to give real answers to our questions, whether we chain ourselves to the railroad tracks to stop a deportation, or we simply host a fundraiser in our home to raise money for the people who are going to go out and do those things. We must ask, whom can we set free from bondage on this Sabbath day? Because never again is now for everyone. May it be so. Blessed be, Ashe, and Amen.